The wind, thin and sharp, carried the scent of pine and something else. Something ancient, like cold stone and forgotten earth. Dean ignored it, his gaze fixed on the broken silhouette of a gulch. Below them, nestled in a bowl of rust-colored hills, lay the skeletal remains of a town that time, and perhaps something else, had chewed clean. The sun, a bruised orange disk, bled light across warped timbers and collapsed roofs, painting the scene in a palette of decay. "All right, last chance to turn back, thrill-seeker," Dean said, his voice carrying a dry edge. He adjusted the straps of his heavy pack, the weight familiar and comforting. His breath plumed white in the crisp air. He had organized this expedition, planned every route, every contingency. He thrived on the unknown, but always with a calculated risk. Beside him, the thrill-seeker grinned, a glint in their eye that Dean found both irritating and, admittedly, useful. And miss out on the legendary He Gulch curse? Besides, the historian promised them ghosts. The historian, a lean figure already consulting a thick, leather-bound journal, scoffed softly. More like unfortunate mining accidents and a particularly nasty outbreak of influenza. The disappearances, those are harder to explain, but hardly supernatural. They pushed their spectacles higher on their nose, the lenses catching the fading light. Though the local accounts are quite vivid. A pervasive chill, voices from the earth, shadows that moved against the light. Dean simply grunted. Superstition sells tours. We are here for the architecture, the sheer desolation. To see what happens when a town just gives up. He pulled a crumpled map from a side pocket, tracing a finger across the faded lines. We will hit the old assay office first, then the general store. The main shaft entrance is too unstable for a full descent, but there's a rumor of an old storage bunker near the secondary processing plant. That's our prize. The cautious one, who had been lingering at the edge of the overlook, pulled their jacket tighter. "Are we sure about this, Dean?" The local shopkeeper, the one who sold us the jerky, he looked at us like we were walking into a funeral pyre. He kept talking about the Whispering Rock and how the mountain remembers. Their voice was low, tinged with genuine apprehension. He waved a dismissive hand. Old man's tales. Good for atmosphere, not for actual risk assessment. The mountain remembers a botched mining operation and a few unlucky souls. The air grew heavier with each step, shedding the clean mountain crispness for something dustier, laced with the metallic tang of rust and the faint, sweet decay of long-dead wood. He led the way, his senses alert, cataloging every detail. A broken wagon wheel half buried in the dirt. A child's shoe, leathery and stiff, peeking from under a collapsed porch. These were the morbid trophies of urban exploration, the remnants of lives abruptly halted. Inside the assay office, motes of dust danced in the single shaft of light piercing a grimy window. The air hung thick and still, carrying the faint, cloying smell of stagnant water and something sharper, like old blood. He ran a gloved hand over a rusted scale, its brass pan coated in green verdigris. The gulch takes its due, and another. Beneath the stone, it waits. They traced the letters with a finger, a frown deepening their brow. These aren't just local superstitions. Miners facing ruin, looking for something to blame. He moved toward the back of the building, where his map indicated a faint trail leading toward the supposed bunker. "Come on, let's find our waiting place." The trail was barely visible, overgrown with skeletal weeds that scraped against their trousers. It wound behind a cluster of derelict shacks, their windows like vacant eyes. Then, partially obscured by a tumble of moss-covered rocks and a gnarled, dead juniper, he spotted it. A rectangular slab of concrete, almost swallowed by the earth, with a heavy, rusted metal hatch set into its center. The hatch had a single, massive padlock, corroded beyond recognition, but still firmly in place. Bingo! A thrill of accomplishment cutting through the strange unease that had settled over him. This was the kind of discovery that made the whole trip worthwhile. He knelt, examining the lock. Well, that's not going anywhere. The thrill-seeker was already rummaging in their pack, pulling out a set of bolt cutters. Good thing he packed these. Never know when you'll need to liberate some forgotten history. As the heavy jaws of the cutters bit into the rusted shackle, the sound echoed unnaturally, a sharp crack that seemed to reverberate not just through the air, but through the very ground beneath their feet. It wasn't fear, he told himself, but the natural caution of an explorer about to enter an unknown space. He pushed the thought aside. This was just another abandoned structure, a relic of human industry. Nothing more. He gripped the handle and pulled. The hatch lifted with a long, drawn-out shriek, exposing a black maw that swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. Below, a set of concrete steps vanished into the gloom. The air felt heavy, like a physical weight on his lungs. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to step back, to seal the hatch and walk away. But the thrill of discovery, the lure of the unknown, was a stronger current. Well, his voice sounding oddly small in the sudden vastness of the opening. The metallic, acrid smell intensified, and he realized it was the smell of old blood, dried and forgotten, lingering in the air for decades. Or perhaps, he thought, it was just his imagination. But the thought did not bring comfort. The dust-choked path gave way to a skeletal grid of streets, each line defined by the husks of buildings. His boots crunched on gravel and shattered glass as he stepped into Blackwood Gulch. The wind, no longer just a distant murmur, whistled through empty window frames, a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. It tugged at the brim of his cap, cold and insistent, like a hand trying to turn his head. He ignored it, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Here, time had not merely stopped, it had calcified. A general store, its painted sign peeling like sunburnt skin, sagged inwards, a single rusted can of peaches still visible on a shelf through the grimy pane. Farther down, a saloon's swinging doors hung askew, groaning softly in the breeze. The air tasted of dry earth and something metallic, a faint acrid tang that pricked the back of his throat. This wasn't just abandonment. It was a snapshot of a life abruptly ended. "Place is a tomb," the colleague murmured, his voice tight, eyes darting from one crumbling facade to the next. He clutched his camera bag tighter. Dean offered a grunt, a non-committal sound. His own camera, a heavy, familiar weight, felt steady in his grip. He walked towards what might have been the town's central square, a patch of cracked dirt where a desiccated fountain stood, its basin filled with leaves and debris. A child's wooden wagon, painted a faded blue, lay overturned near its base. A single wheel broken off, its splintered spokes reaching skyward like tiny, grasping fingers. The sight wasn't overtly threatening, but it was deeply unsettling. A toy, frozen mid-play, speaking of innocence violated. He knelt, his fingers tracing the rough grain of the wagon. Each building they passed held its own quiet tragedy. A miner's shack still contained a rough cot, blankets folded neatly, a tin cup on a bedside crate. A half-eaten meal petrified on a table hinted at a hasty departure, a life interrupted. The details were too specific, too personal to be merely forgotten. "Look at this," the stranger called out, his voice hushed, pulling he towards a support beam in what was once a communal hall. Scratched deep into the old timber were crude carvings. They weren't symbols or words. They were shapes, angular and sharp, forming patterns that seemed to shift as he looked at them, their lines almost vibrating against his perception. Triangles warped into impossible polygons, interlocking at angles that defied conventional geometry. They didn't depict anything recognizable, yet they held a disturbing resonance, like a half-forgotten dream of something vast and indifferent. Old mining towns were full of oddities. He ran his glove over the rough wood, trying to ground himself in the tangible. The shapes did not give. As they moved on, a pervasive sense of observation settled over He. The dust motes dancing, these shafts of light filtering through broken windows seemed to coalesce for a fleeting moment into indistinct forms at the periphery of his vision. He blinked, and they were gone. Just dust. "Did you?" Pulling his jacket tighter, Dean scanned the desolate street. Only the wind. Probably just the wind playing tricks these shafts, injecting a note of certainty into his voice he didn't entirely feel. Or an echo. Old minds are full of them. To the gaping maw, "This looks promising. This place, it feels wrong." He clapped him on the shoulder, a firm, reassuring gesture that was more for his own benefit than the colleagues. "That's why we're here, isn't it? To find what's wrong. It's an abandoned town. Of course it's going to feel a little off. Years of neglect, trapped air. Come on." He pulled at a rusted iron grate, revealing a narrow, descending passage carved roughly into the earth. He clicked on his headlamp, its beam cutting a stark path through the absolute blackness. The passage, narrow and claustrophobic, sloped downwards, the rough-hewn walls slick with condensation. The sound of their own breathing became amplified, a ragged chorus the suffocating quiet. The passage opened into a small, square room, crudely constructed from concrete blocks and rough timber. Water dripped rhythmically from a fissure-through ceiling, each drop echoing with unnerving clarity, the confined space. He swept his headlamp beam across the walls. They were bare, save for a single, deeper indentation. It was another carving, similar to the one as the communal hall, but larger, more intricate. The lines were sharper, the angles more pronounced. It depicted no form, no recognizable object, only a swirling vortex of impossible geometries, twisting in on themselves, drawing the eye into a central point that seemed to recede endlessly. His breathing stuttered. He shook his head, clearing the strange sensation. "Interesting," he managed, his voice a little strained. He turned, his headlamp beam catching the colleague's face, pale and drawn. His eyes were not looking at the carving, but at the dim edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the headlamp's light. I think I saw something. It moved. Dean focused his beam on the spot. Just the rough concrete, the faint sheen of dampness. "It's just the light," his voice firm, projecting confidence. Reflections. And the thing that occupied it, he suddenly understood, had no need for doors or windows. His boots crunched on the gravel, each step a dry whisper against the vast silence. The wind, a constant mournful presence, scraped through empty window frames, a sound like dry bones rattling. He walked past the husks of buildings, their wooden skeletons bleached and fractured by years of sun and neglect. A colleague, a photographer with a heavy backpack, angled his lens towards a collapsed saloon, its signboard swinging on rusted chains. The groan of metal on metal cut through the air, momentarily louder than the wind, then faded. Dean felt his neck prickle, a familiar sensation he usually attributed to the desert's dry chill. The street narrowed, hemmed in by more structures, each one a testament to sudden abandonment. A child's shoe, brittle with age, lay half-buried the dust near a porch. His gaze lingered on it. He imagined the suddenness, the rush. The hairs on his arms stood on end. He dismissed it as a draft, a trick of the swirling airthets. A few yards ahead, another colleague, a quiet man who specialized in structural integrity. Voicey low. Or something more. He nodded, a flicker of professional curiosity overriding the nascent unease. It wasn't a typical basement door. A thick, rusted steel plate, almost flush with the ground, was propped open by a fallen timber. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow, uneven staircase descending into absolute black. The steps, crudely cut from rock, twisted at an angle that felt subtly wrong, an architectural defiance of gravity. It felt less like a descent and more like a fall into a forgotten maw. An underground bunker, Dean. He ignored the comment, his focus on the beam of light dancing across ancient dust motes. The walls were rough-hewn stone, seeping with a perpetual dampness. Water dripped somewhere far below, a rhythmic drip, drip, drip that seemed to measure the past heron's slow, deliberate beats. The air grew heavy, pressing Eirim, and the metallic tang sharpened, a constant undercurrent. As they descended, the light from the surface vanished completely. He felt the weight of the earth above them, Thet, in different mass. The steps twisted again, making his sense of direction warp. He felt disoriented, as if the space itself was playing a cruel trick. They reached a landing, a small, square room, then another winding passage. The flashlight beam revealed a series of rough-hewn chambers, interconnected by strangely angled tunnels. There were no straight lines here, no right angles that felt true. Each turn led to another turn, a labyrinthine construction that defied logic. In one of the larger chambers, Thut caught something. A wooden crate, remarkably preserved in cold air, sat against a wall. Dust motes danced in theme. He approached cautiously, his boots stirring up a fine, gritty powder. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing the brittle wood. The crate creaked, a soft, protesting sound. Inside, nestled amongst decaying canvas, lay a collection of items. A tarnished oil lamp, its wick long gone to dust. A stack of yellowed newspapers, their headlines screaming of disappearances and unexplained phenomena from the late 1800s. The dates were smudged, but the urgency of the bold typeface was clear. The article detailed the disappearance of an entire mining crew swallowed by the earth, with no trace of a collapse. Another spoke of families vanishing from their homes, leaving behind only uneaten meals and open doors. Beneath the newspapers, bound in a fraying leather cover, was a small, thick journal. Its pages were brittle, filled with spidery, almost illegible script. The ink had faded, but the desperate tone of the entries was palpable. Oddly a few lines, his brow furrowing. "The angles are wrong," an entry declared. "They sing from the deep places, and the earth shifts to their cadence." Another scrawled in a different, more frantic hand. He spoke of patterns, of spaces that shouldn't exist. He's gone now, but the patterns remain, etched in Thek, in there, in Thend. A sudden sharp clang echoed from aware-adjacent tunnels, a sound like mythotriking stone. It was loud, too loud for a settling building, and he couldn't explain it. He tried. Probably just some old machinery settling, or a rockfall, he offered. But the words felt thin, unconvincing, even to himself. The air in Thanker seemed to thicken, pressing down on him, erg the warmth from his skin. The metallic scent intensified, now almost overwhelming, a taste in Thek of his throat. But his explorer's determination and a stubborn refusal to admit fear kept him rooted. He had to know what else this place held. Dean's boots crunched the gravel, each step a dry whisper against the vast silence. He walked past the husks of buildings, their wooden skeletons bleached and fractured by years of sun and neglect, toward the crumbling slope at the edge of town where the map indicated the bunker entrance. His determined stride, a practiced show of confidence, felt less convincing with every gust that snatched at his jacket, chilling him to the bone. He could feel the eyes of his companions on his back, their quiet footsteps a hesitant echo behind him, hidden beneath a tangle of thorny brush and broken rock. It was a concrete slab, half buried, with a rusted, heavy hatch that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The air here was still, thick with the scent of damp earth and some thair, a metallic tang, like old blood or corroded iron. He bent, tugging at the hatch. Below, the light from his lamp struggled to define the space. The walls were uneven, patched with what looked like hastily applied plaster that was now peeling in brittle sheets. Then came the younger woman, her lamp beam dancing nervously. The confined space seemed to press in on them, the air growing heavier with each breath. He moved deeper, to stare across impossible angles. The bunker wasn't just old, it felt wrong. Corridors twisted where they shouldn't, turning corners that didn't quite add up, leading to dead-end rooms that felt too small, then too vast. It was as if the architect had forgotten the laws of perspective. They entered a large, circular wasser, its ceiling lost in the varech of their lamps. The walls here were covered in a series of strange, intricate carvings. Not symbols he recognized, but swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the theory of his vision. He felt a peculiar pressure behind Hitoph Theret beneath his scalp. He spun, his lamp beam cutting across the gloom. The nervous one stood frozen, one hand pressed hard against his forehead, his eyes wide, staring at a section of the wall that, to Dean, looked utterly unremarkable. Is it? A voice sharper than he intended. The nervous one didn't answer, his mouth working silently. Like a fish out of water. He pointed a trembling finger. The gun moving. He focused his lamp the spot. Just the same swirling patterns, immobile, ancient. He felt a surge of frustration, but also a sliver of genuine fear. He scanned the faces of the other explorer and the young woman. The woman's lamp withied the same spot, her brow furrowed in concentration. Just for a fraction of a second, the carvings the wall did seem to undulate, the lines blurring, then snapping back into place. It was like a ripple in a still pond, a momentary distortion of solid matter. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision, but thwastling sensation lingered. He heard the nervous one make a low, whimpering sound. "It's the light." His voice a little too firm. He didn't believe it himself. Tricks of the eye. Old wiring, maybe. He knew there was no wiring. But then, the resonant hum began to vibrate through the floor, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, burrowing into their bones. It wasn't that it was deep, profound, and utten. The air crackled their Evie, charged. The nervous one cried out, a raw, terrified sound, and backward, wassing against the damp concrete wall. His headlamp clattered to the floor, its beam spinning wildly, painting the impossible angles of the bunker with chaotic light. His head, the nervous one whimpered, his skull. It feels like someone pushed a nail through his ear. Dean rushed to him, kneeling. The other explorer and the young woman stood rigid, their nervous one, their faces reflecting a dawning horror. And it spoke. Spoke what? Gak, his voice voicerds. The nervous one rasped. But he looked up, his lamp beam sweeping across the undulating nervous one, then to a section where the concrete seemed to bulge unnaturally. A sickly gray-green growth like nervous one. It pulsed faintly, a subtle internal light, and the angles around it to bend, to recede into themselves, defying the very concept of space. It was not concrete, not natural stone, but something else. Something too inorganic yet disturbingly alive, like a tumor, the fabric of reality. The group was silent. Their collective was a palpable thing, a weight in the air. The nervous one was the ground, his gaze distant, his mind somewhere else. He knew with a certainty that the expedition had fractured. His leadership, his care-constructed cynicism, was crumbling under the weight nervous one truth. The bunker wasn't just abandoned, it was active. And whatever lay within it had just acknowledged their presence. His resolve, a brittle thing he usually kept well hidden, hardened into something like flint. He walked past the husks of build-waste, their wooden skeletons bleached and fractured by years of sun and ceaseless arid air. The silence that had once felt vast now felt heavy, pressing down from the bruised sky. "We need to go," the guide said, his voice tight, eye voice toward the skeletal remains of the old assay office. "Now, this place, it's wrong." The photographer, usually so eager for the next hacking composition, only nodded, her camera hanging forgotten against her hip. Her face, usually alight with curiosity, was now a pale mask. The strange, shifting shadows, the way the air seemed to thicken and grow cold in places where no draft should reach, it had all coalesced into an undeniable wrongness. They mirth a desperate urgency, their boots kicking Tohi Main Street. Dean's gaze swept Thazon, searching for the familiar notch in the distant hills where the old service then naked its way out. The thought of leaving, of putting distance between himself and Blackwood Gulch, felt like a desperate gasp for air. Their vehicle, a battered SUV, sat waiting where they'd left it, a forlorn metal shell in the vast desolation. The relief that was Thier was potent, almost dizzying. He fumbled with the keys, his fingimsy, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine coughed once, then again, a pathetic, dying gasp. Just a weak click from under the hood. "What's wrong?" the guide asked, leaning in, his face etched with growing alarm. He popped the hood. Yet a faint, acrid smell, like ozone mixed with something metallic and vaguely organic, hung in the air. It wasn't just dead. It felt, as if something had simply siphoned the energy away. "It's not starting." His voice flat. Complete voice aerographer walked to the front of the vehicle, him brow furrowed. She pointed to the tires. "Look." All 4 tires were deflated, not punctured, but as if hair had simply seeped out, leaving them flat against the dusty ground. There were no punctures, no jagged tears. This wasn't random bad luck. This was right, Dean said, forcing a calm he-dithil. "There's an old maintenance road, north side. It connects to the highway eventually. It will be a long walk, but it's our only way out on foot." They started walking, the sun a malevolent eye in the endless sky. Every rustle of dry brush, the distant creak of decaying timber became a threat. He kept his eyes the path, but his peripheral betrayed him. Shapes seemed to coalesce in the shimmering heat haze, only to dissolve when theocked directly. The distant hills seemed to shift, their contours subtly wrong, angles sharper, more abrupt than he remembered. Hours passed. Thetan its slow, agonizing descent, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. They too reached the maintenance road by now. It spun wildly, then settled, pointing northeast. He knew with a sickening certainty that they had been walking west. They were going in circles. The town wasn't just Trappium, it was disorienting them. "We need shelter," the guide rasped, his throat dry. Before nightfall. He remembered a detail from an old prospector's journal he'd found online. A forgotten bunker built into a hillside, a relic from the town's early days, meant to protect against rockslides or, Pew was something less tangible. It wasn't on any modern map. "There's an old bunker," pointing towards a cluster of low hills that seemed to bulge unnaturally from the landscape. Might be a place to regroup, figure out a new plan. They stumbled towards it, the last vestiges of daylight fading into a sickly twilight. The entrance was a low, heavy metalid, half buried under an avalanche of loose rock and thorny scrub. It took all 3 othering and grunting to pry it open, the hinges screaming a protest that echoed like a dying animal. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and something else. A metallic tang, like old blood or ozone. Dean clicked on his headlamp. Water dripped somewhere dare-thin, each drop echoing with unnerving clarity. They moved cautiously, he in the lead, his a hyper-alert. The space opithito a larger chamber, circular and squat, the ceiling impossibly low. The walls were lined with what looked like crude shelves, now empty save for a thick layer of dust and a few petrified splinters of wood. But it was the far wall that drew He's eye, making the blood in his veins turn to slush. Carved into the rock, beneath layers of grime, were symbols. Not hieroglyphs, not pictograms, but something else entirely. Shapes that defied logic, lines that converged at impossible angles, forming patterns that seemed to vibrate wassalant, malevolent energy. They pulsed, subtly, in the periphery of his vision, as if the rock its breathing, as the non-Euclidean geometry he'd read about in obscure texts, the kind of impossible are-seemed thato mind. And beneath the carvings, scrawled in what looked like dried pigment, faded but still legible, there at English, not Latin, but a language that twisted his tongue just by looking at it. Yet somehow, he understood it. The gates are opened by the despair of many. This wasn't some local ghost story. This was ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent. The entity didn't haunt Blackwood Gulch. It was Blackwood Gulch. It had merely been dormant, waiting for enough despair, enough fear to wake. And they, in their ignorant curiosity, had provided it. The roads weren't blocked by chance. Their vehicle wasn't dead by coincidence. It was a dry, skittering sound, like claws on stone, or perhaps something trying to get in. The windless, endless tormentor clawed at the theg structures of Blackwood Gulch, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the town's dying breath. He stood at the edge of the collapsing Athefis, his gaze sweeping across the bleached skeletons of was and businesses. Escape, he knew, was not a matter. The ply walking awa the roads out were impassive seemed by Rockton time. The entity, whatever it was, had woven itself into the very fabric of this place. A silent, predatory present heard them without eyes or ears. His jaw, usually slack with a cynical indifference, was now a rigid line. They were trapped. "They need answers," Dean announced, his voice a low rumble agagale. The colleague huddled deeper into their jacket, shivered, but offered no arguas. The stranger, a quiet observer since the first terror, merely nodded, eyes wide and fixed, the desolate landscape. He understood the unspoken fear. If they didn't understand what hunted them, they were merely prey. He remembered an old map, found in a miner's shack, hinting at an emergency shelter, a bunker, built into the hillside during the town's boom years. It was a long shot, a desperate hope that some forgotten record, some diary entry, might offer a clue. He led them through the skeletal remains of the main street, past the general store whose shelves had long since collected the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The path was uneven, treacherous. He moved via renewed purpose, his gaze sharp, hunting for the Landemthemberd was the faded parchment, a cluster of unusual layered bowanier the old his entrance. They found it, half buried by scree, a rusted metal hatch barely visible bent the angle of thorny scrub. The air here was still, shielded from the wind, but it carried a different chill, a damp metallic tang that spoke of enclosed spaces and forgotten time. He gripped the corroded handle, grunting with it that he forced it open. The Erte steps were slick with condensation, leading down into a suffocating quiet. The bunker was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, each turn revealing more of the same. Bare concrete walls weeping moisture, defunct ventilation shafts humming with imagined drafts. The air grew heavier with a step, pressing down, a physical weight that made thehing shallow and difficult. Dean's light picked out the occasional detail. A rusted cot, a stack of empty crates. Each object a silent testament to a hasty errand. Then the ended. A small, reinforced room, its steel door slightly ajar. Inside, a single wooden table stood, miraculously intact, laden with a chaotic array of ledgers, faded photographs, and a stack of journals bound in brittle leather. The air in this room was different. Ahmed with a palpable tension, a sense of disturbed knowledge. The colleague gasped, pointing a trembling finger at a series of crude, disturbanicole drawings tacked to the wall. He ignored the drawings for it. His attention drawn to a thick, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with a symbol he didn't recognize, a jagged, multi-pronged star. He flipped it open, the brittle pages crumbling slightly at his touch. Theat was a tight, looping hand, detailing years of mining reports, weather patterns, and then, abruptly, a shift. The fear, the isolation, the ground itself is its maw. The entries spoke of a presence, not a creature. A hunger, Thetian thing roused by the excavation, by the greed that tore at the earth. It wasn't just the disappearances. It was a slow, insidious consumption of sanity, of life force. The drawings, he now realized, were attempts by taste inhabitants to visually theant the entity's influence, the way it warped reality, making the familiar subtly, horrifyingly wrong. The journals hinted at desperate measures, crude attempts to appease the entity. Rituals involving offerings, not of blood, but of memory, of self. One particularly disturbing passage described a biya, ausweis of a part of the town's collective will, to force the entity back into slumber. The details were maddeningly vague, shrouded in archaic language and terrified scrawls. It spoke of a specific location, a heart of Thetheh, and a precise alignment of celestial bodies, a window of vulnerability. A sudden, sharp movement made he jump. The stranger, who had been poring over a different journal, slammed it shut. It'd be a sacrifice of life, not exactly. A surrender of the self. We just need to find the right place, the right time. He began pacing, his movements jerky, a frantic energy seizing him. The old calendar, it shows it. Tonight, at the old shaft, they can do. The hay can make it sleep again. Dean's mind reeled. The stranger's certainty was terrifying. The information was fragmented, dangerous. Wait, he commanded, his the sharp with urgency. Voice, understand this. We need to be careful. A rash move could make things worse. But the stranger wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on some unseen point, a desperate manic gleam in them. He pushed past he, a wild resolve hardening his features. No time for caution. Escape, he knew, was a concept rapidly losing its meaning. Wind howled a dirge through the skeletal town, a sound that seemed to strip away more than just his body heat. He turned from the collapsing assay office, the bitter taste of defeat on his tongue, and scanned the desolate landscape. The colleague, a gaunt shadow, shivered beside him, her gaze fixed on Theon. Thenger, however, pointed, a trembling finger aimthek of disturbed earth near the old cannery. There, seemed Croa his topi. The map. It showed Voicery access point. Dean, despite his fading hope, felt a flicker of grim curiosity. He led them towards the spot, the groundled their air boots with a soft, sucking sound. Hidden beneath a tangle of rusted corrugated metal and loose soil, a crude, reinforced hatch lay half-buried. It smelled of Darth and something else, something metallic and cloying, like old blood mixed with ozone. With a grunt, he pulled at the rusted lever. The mechanism shrieked, a sound like tortured metal before groaning open. A gust of fetid air, thick and he illowed out, carrying the scent of decay and something indefinably wrong. Below, a narrow utehaft plunged into darkness. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing in on his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The metallic tang intensified, mingling with a faint, sickly sweetness that clung to the back of his throat. At the bottom, a short tunnel opened into a larger chamber. His was not a normal space. Or in the Buers still, yet it felt alive. A presence that hummed just beyond, the Ange of Hearing. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam, then as if caught in an unseen current. In the centre, the chamber stood a massive, pitted metal contraption, utterly alien. Cables, thick as his arm, snaked from air the impossibly angled walls. On a cracked concrete slab nearby, a series of crude, unsettling symbols were carved, repeating in an untha loop. They were not theograms or letters, but impossible geometry waces that seemed to twist the eye, hinting at dimensions that shouldn't exist. He saw his breath plume before him. Then, a low thrum vibrated through the floor, rising in pitch, a sound that bypassed his ears and rooted directly within his skull. He fumbled for a backup, his fingers slick with sweat. Not from the colleague, not from the stranger, but a voice that seemed to rise from the very concrete around them. Dean frantically clicked Cmect, and it flared to casting an erratic beam. The stranger was on his cuff ends clawing, his eyes wide and vacant. He thrashed, then utterly still, collapsing into a heap. His skin seemed therein on a waxy sheen, his eyes staring blankly at the impossible ceiling. He was gone, not just dead, but emptied. The colleague shrieked, posumed embling finger at the stow-inert form. It's inside him. It's in the air. His own breathing stuttered. He had seen the stranger's last momentary adulterated fear and the abrupt, profound absence. That theirs was no animal, no man-made horror. This was the thing that consumed the very eshes off a person. The Itotham Shayad, a visual distorts strangeream of his light, as if the space itself was rippling. The impossible Angthahe sunker walls seemed to sharpen, to lean in, threatening to crush them. The entity had revealed itself, not as a physical form, but as a violation of, a devourer of consciousness. His cynicism, his carefully constructed warrior, crumbled into dust. He had always believed in what a Thed see, touch, explain. But this was an affront to reason, a terrifying silent hunger that had just taken a life, leaving behind only an empty shell. The fight was not for survival of the body, but for the very integrity of the mind, that to air itself now hummed with a malevolent, satisfied vibration. The others, a colleague whose eyes held too much frantic desperation. A stranger with an unnerving calm, waited near th bunkeraw of Tharground bunker. The air inside Thenker was a stagnant weight, thick the smell of damp concrete and something talc, like old blood or rusted iron. Dean's flashlight beam keroo the oppressive gloom, revealing walls scarred with graffiti and crude, faded diagrams. Dust motes dance, the anemic light, an endless, silent snowfall. The bunker was a labyrinth of low-ceiled corridors, each turn air deeper into the earth's cold embrace, a perfect inverse of the desolate world above. Here, the wind's mournful cries were muted, replaced by the persistent drip of unseen water, a monotonous rhythm that grated against the raw edges of his nerves. The born of desperation and a few cryptic notes found scrawled archment in the gulch's abandoned church, with Themsi at best. A Rybunker called it. A way to Theor at least repel, the entity that had claimed Blackwood Gulch. It involved an offering, a focal point, and a steincantation that the stranger, surprisingly, seemed to know by heart. The colleague clutched a heavy ashed lantern, its yellow glow casting their faces in a sickly pall bunkers. His hand on Athef the pickaxe he'd salvaged, the rough wood a grounding sensation against his clammy palm. The stranger, silent as a wraith, led them to a circular chamber at the bunker's lowest level. The stranger placed a small, crudely carved idol onto the plinth, its features indistinct, almost melting into the stone. He watched, the jaw tightening, as the colleague fumbled with a small leather pouch, extracting a vial of murky vitoquid. This was the Thering. A low thrum began, not from within the bunker, but seeming to vibrate through the very earth beneath their feet. Dean's breathing stuttered in his throat. He saw Strangair's shoulders tense, the lantern shaking in his grip. The stranger began to speak, his voice a low, guttural chant. The words ancien voicen, twisting the familiar English tongue into something unrecognizable, The incantation deepened. The air grew heavy, pressing down a stranger forgotten. He clenched his teeth, fighting the urge to clap his hands over his strangers chanting. The more insistent held the encroaching black at bay. The entity was here. It wasn't a shape that could be leagues ents that filled the bunker, making the very air vibrate with its incomprehensible vastness. The ritual, he realized with a Sikayr lurk, wasn't about fighting it, but about bunkerging it, about drawing its indifferent attention. The true horror was not its malice, but its utter lack of concern for their ants. Suddenly, the stranger's head snapped up, his eyes fixed on something he couldn't see, somewhere above them, beyond the low ceiling. A thin, reedy sound, like a child weeping, echoed from deep within the earth, seeming to come from every direction at once. Cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete walls, dust showering down. The plinth at the center of the chamber began to glow with a faint, sickly green light, pulsing in Ritfari, the subterranean thrum. Dean's gaze was drawn to the idol, its crude features now seeming to writhe and bunker-mirroring the impossible anaf the room. The offering, the ritual, it was all wrong. They had opened a door, not closed one. The antithonot repelled. It was curious. The colleague, whimpering, stumbled backward, tripping over a loose piece of debris. He scrambled to his feet, clasped stranger bunker door, his fingers scraping against the rustida. "They hath Thago!" he shrieked, his voice Cree. But he knew there was nowhere. Voice he ritual had been a desperate gamble, and they had lost. The entity was awake, its gaze now fixed upon them, not with anger, but with an ancient, terrifying ithorance. Wind, a raw, toothless Thethet's exposed skin, scouring the last vestiges of warmth from his bones. He pushed away from the skeletal remains of the assay office, a fresh wound in the already scarred landscape. The bitter taste on his tongue was wasp dust, but the metallic tang of something far more profound. He stumbled, boo-wazenching on shale and rusted debris. His visithying at the edge colleague roaned a entity symphony of creaking timbers and rattling tin, each the lament for what had been lost. He needed shelter, a place where wind couldn't stir bunkerity from his mind, where the vast, indifferent sky didn't press down with such crushing weight. His gaze, desperate and unfocused, snagged onthek of ground beneath a listing, half-buried structure that might once have been a sentity. A darker, deeper shadow clung there, a jagged tear in the earth. He approached cautiously, his every muscle protesting. The opening, partially concealed by collapse-variegated metal and thorny scrub, exhaled hissed, Therath. He hadn't seen it before, not truly. It felt less like a discovery and more like an unwelcome summons. The descent was Theron slick with a fine, persistent dampness. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth, stale metal, and something things sterile and ancient, like dust from a forgotten star. The single beam from his flickeried lamp struggled against the encroaching gloom. Not quite perpendicular, not quite parallel. Not of his lamp, but another weaker light ahead. He rounded a bend, the corridor widening into a low-ceiling hisber. 3 figures huddled together, their faces pale and drawn in the anemic glow of a single air-powered lantern. It was the colleague, amped Agatharet pillar, eyes with unseeing. Beside him, the stranger, into a fetal position, shivering uncontrollably. And near them, a third, remaining member of their group, sat upright, eyes fixed on some point beyond the wall, a faint, unsettling smile playing on their lips. Their stillness are terrifying than any scream. But the spark had gone. The bunker offered no true warmth, only a reprieve from the wind's assault. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, a low thrumming that he felt more than heard. He pressed a palm against the concrete. Oraps, he thought. His mind was finally fracturing. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, scraped raw. R. The colleague didn't respond, his gaze locked. Feather whimpered, a low animal sound. They were here, but they weren't here. Blackwood, he had taken something from them, something viwazed, irreplaceable. Antied, with a sickening lurch, Vakuligan from him. He felt a peculiar lightness in his head, a detachment from his own body, as if he were Ostranger actions from a distance. The vastness of what they had faced, the sheer Una scale of it, pressed in on him, threatening to tow a very fabric of his being. A drip echoed from deeper within the bunker, a slow, methodical plink that marked the passage schism. He pushed himself up, the stiffness in his joints a dull ache. This place was a kabunker sanctuary. The entity, whatever it was, had touched this place too. Its indifference permeated the very air. He nudged the colleague. "We have to go. We have to leave." The man blinked, slowly, but made no move. Dean had to drag him, the colleague Avi and unresponsive. The third survivor, still smiling, followed Strungera word, their footsteps unnervingly silent. The climb out of the bunker was arduous, a slow ascent back into the desolate landscape. Wind still howled, but now it seemed to carry a different note, a lingering echo of the horror they had just endured. As they emerged into the pale, bruised light of a false every Lackwood, he stretched before them, a graveyard of dreams and sanity. The buildings, the skeletal remains of the town, seemed to twist and writhe in the distance, their forms shither subtly. Impossibly, in the periphery of his vision, he found the old G-bunker still that they had left it, though it was covered ivory the doot the wasta sag on its tires as Aya hosted. He helped the colleague into the back, then the stranger. The third survivor climbed in with Unentity Rithel wearing that faint, unsettling smile. Fed behind the wheel, his hands trembling as he turned the key. The Etiged, sputter-old roared to life, a jar thermal sound in a world utterly unhinged. He put the vehicle in gear, Thea's spitting gravel as they pulled away from the town. He didn't look back, not directly. But in the rear-view bunkerack wood, he seemed to shim teeth, to watch them go. He drove, the speedometer creeping higher, putting Duthie between them and the place that had devoured so much. He glanced at the survivors in the back. The colleague was still staring. The stranger towhead escaped Blackwood yes. A piece of it, a sliver of its deference, a fragment of its incomprehensible vastness, had found a new home. He could feel it, humming faintly bewash his own skin, a silent, terrible symphony. Their windows seemed flatter, less vibrant. The colors muted, the sounds distant, the collegal. But the freedom was an illusion. Blackwood, he was gone. Stranger so, terrifyingly, everywhere. The coffee tasted like ash. He stared into the cheap ceramic mug, watching the surf toe the tremor in his hand. 2 months since, wind had scoured his bones clean in Blackwood. He, since the assay office had buckled like a crushed tin can, since he'd tasted the metallic tang of something unspeakable on his tongue. He sat now in a diner, the fluorescent hum a dull throb against the ringing eye's ears, a constant echo of the silence he had learned to fear. He remembered the bunker. After the collapse, after the dust had settled and the last screams had died out, they had stummed colleague gaping maw. A crude, utilitarian space, built into the rock of stranger to withstand blasts, not this. The air had been thick with the scent of damp earth and something and the like old blood mixed with ozone. The single generator, sputtering its last, cast long shud the shadows, that danced with impossible angles, making the concrete walls seem to warp and breathe. A colleague, the one who'd always quaused the heaviest pack, had been trying to fix a broken radio, his fingers fumbling with wires. Dean had watched him, his gaze snagging on the man's reflection in a pulthometal panel. Not the colleague's refan theat. Taas was the same, but the eye his too wide. Too barren the mouth was stretched into a rictus thaseled the jaw impossibly thin. Then, the distortion wathalethally the colleague, muttering about static. He had closed his own eyes, pressing his palms against his temples, trying to iron out the creases in his vision, that wash-eye Seville. Not a creature, not a physical being. It was the space itself, the air, the light, the very fabric of perception. Black Bunker not merely had it was the entity, a vast, hungry consciousness that devoured the boundaries of reality. It didn't chase them with claws or teeth. It eroded their minds, warped their sense, even doubt the ground beneath their feet. The bunker, meant to be a refuge, became a crucible. The walls, Wanktha, seemed to ripple. The floor tilted, not physically, but in the way his mind perceived it. He had seen it, and the other survivors hadn't. Or they pretended not to. The diner door chimed, pulling he back. A young Wath entered, her laughter air and careless as Shteed, the counterstaff. She saw the world as it was meant to be. Solid, pertheel, safe. He saw the hatterability. He'd tried to expathy, to the authorities, to the medical professionals who had offered bland reassurances and stronger sedatives, through a man traumatized, hallucinating, scarred by a near-death ex-colleague, didn't see the truth. The words he spoke, the impossible geometry he described, the very air itself could think. It all dissolved into nuasa, into the ramblings of a broisand. He was isolated, not by distance, but by knowledge. The forbidden, the wash in the veil truly was. How fragile To came when confronted with something so utterly indifferent to its destruction. He no longer felt the thrill of urban exploration. The city's concrete canyons, once an invitacientity like a fragile shell. He saw the cracks in everything. Not a sound, exactly, but an absence of sound. A perfect, unnatural vacuum that pressed against his ear, bunkering his skull with a profound, aching emptiness. Ere the sound of Blackwood heap breathing. He pushed the untouched coffee away. The new cynicism that had replaced the old one was far more insidious. It wasn't about way-susting people. It was about distrusting reality itself. He moved through them. Among the liveth each the news, scanned missing persons reports, his gaze lingering on the blank, hopeful faces. The he-hat awaited the ones who strayed too close to the old, forgotten places. One evening, a local news segment flickered on his cheap television. For a split second, he saw it. He turned back, grinning at the camera, a flicker of defiance in his eyes, before disappearing into the tunnel's depths. Dean watched the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The reporter continued her spiel, oblivious. He knew the subway tunnel had been empty, truthity, just yesterday. Now it was no longer. The entity, fast oldent, airily shifted its appetite. Blackwood. He was not dead. It had merely spread its tendrils, quietly, insidiously, into the unsuspecting world. The scythiant dark, but the lingering shadow of the tunnel, of the impossible angles he had glimpsed, remained burned behind his eyelids. It had was he found a new home. Had the his was the his eyes entity.